The sun baked the cracked earth of Arizona's Superstition mountains as Adolph Ruth, an elderly, limping man in his early 60s, scanned the horizon. In his hand he clutched a tattered, hand-drawn map, gifted to him by his late son, an obsessive treasure hunter. The year was 1931, and Ruth had already made a name for himself as a man who defied odds and chased myths, often at great personal risk. But this time he was hunting the most legendary treasure of them all, Jacob Waltz's fabled Lost Dutchman's gold mine. Ruth's journey had begun years earlier when his son, Erwin Ruth, a well-known explorer, had come into possession of the map from a Mexican soldier claiming to be a descendant of the Peralta family. The Peraltas were said to have mined gold in these mountains, hiding their fortune when they were driven out by Apaches in the mid-1800s. Erwin had wanted to pursue the treasure, but injuries from a previous expedition had left him unable to continue the hunt. Adolph, against all reason and advice, took it upon himself to finish what his son had started. Now, in the oppressive heat of June, Ruth found himself alone, save for his trusted guide, a Pima Indian named Pedro. Pedro had been skeptical from the beginning, warning Ruth that the Superstition Mountains were no place for a man of his age, and the legends of death and curses surrounding the mine were not just stories to frighten tourists. Many had disappeared searching for the Dutchman's gold, their remains sometimes found decades later, often with little more than their bones and journals to tell the tale. Despite the warnings, Ruth was undeterred. He had spent his entire life pursuing the impossible, and this mine, this treasure, was his final quest. He believed the map held the key, with cryptic directions leading to a ridge that few had dared to traverse. The note on the back of the map was a simple phrase, etched in Spanish: "Cuidado con la sombra de la muerte." Beware the shadow of death. It wasn't until they reached a narrow canyon that Pedro stopped abruptly. His eyes darted around, scanning the jagged rock formations and the twisted trees that clung to life amidst the desert sands. "This is where I leave you, Señor Ruth," Pedro said quietly, his voice filled with something close to fear. "I will not go further. Too many have gone into this place and never returned." Ruth, determined as ever, nodded but dismissed Pedro's apprehension. "I understand, Pedro. I'll continue alone. You've been paid well for your services." Pedro hesitated, his dark eyes scanning Ruth one last time as though trying to etch the man's face into memory. "May the spirits be with you," he muttered, before turning and disappearing into the desert without another word. Ruth's gaze turned back to the canyon. He adjusted his pack, tightened his grip on the map, and pressed forward. The air seemed to grow heavier with each step. The silence of the desert broken only by the crunch of his boots on the gravel. The walls of the canyon loomed higher as he descended deeper, narrowing around him until the light from the fading sun could barely reach the ground. Hours passed, and soon Ruth found himself standing at the base of a cliff face. His heart pounded with anticipation. The map had led him here, to a place where few had stood before. The shadow cast by the cliff seemed to dance before him, stretching across the ground like the gnarled fingers of an unseen hand. He knew the time had come to act. He unfolded the map one last time, running his fingers over the worn edges, tracing the path he had followed. The legend of the Dutchman said the mine was hidden in plain sight, but only visible when the sun's last light hit the canyon at just the right angle. Ruth waited, his pulse quickening as the minutes ticked by. Then, as the sun kissed the horizon, the shadow shifted, and there it was. A narrow crevice, almost invisible from where he stood, was illuminated for just a moment as the sunlight hit the rock face. Ruth felt a surge of triumph as he scrambled toward the entrance, his old legs trembling beneath him. Inside, the air was cooler, and the passage led deeper into the mountainside. His flashlight flickered to life, casting long shadows against the walls. The path was narrow, jagged, but Ruth could feel it. He was close. For hours he explored the tunnels, following twists and turns that seemed to go on forever. But then in a small chamber deep within the mountain, his breath caught in his throat. Gold. Raw, glistening veins of gold, running through the stone like rivers of molten light. It was real. After all the years, all the stories, the Dutchman's mine was real. Ruth dropped to his knees, his hands shaking as he reached out to touch the treasure that had eluded so many before him. But as his fingers brushed the cold metal, a low rumbling sound echoed through the cave. Ruth froze, his heart skipping a beat. The ground beneath him trembled, and the ceiling above him groaned under the weight of centuries of rock. Suddenly, the walls began to shake violently, and Ruth realized too late that the mine was collapsing. He scrambled to his feet, his flashlight flickering as dust and debris rained down around him. The gold was forgotten as panic set in. He turned, racing back the way he had come, but the tunnels had changed. The passage he had entered through was gone, buried beneath tons of rock. For days, Ruth wandered the darkened tunnels, his supplies dwindling, his hope fading. He kept the map close, but it was useless now. He was lost, trapped in a maze of stone with no way out. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that a group of prospectors, out on a routine expedition, stumbled upon his body. Adolf Ruth was found slumped against a rock, his face gaunt, his hands still clutching the map that had led him to his doom. But the gold? It was never found. The entrance to the mine had vanished once again, swallowed by the earth as though it had never existed. Rumors spread quickly after Ruth's death. Some said the Apache spirits had taken him, punishing him for trespassing on sacred ground. Others claimed the mine was cursed, a trap set by Jacob Waltz to protect his treasure for all eternity. But one thing was certain, Ruth's discovery only deepened the mystery. More men would come, driven by greed and ambition, but none would return. The lost Dutchman's gold mine remained hidden, waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to seek its riches. In the months that followed Adolf Ruth's death, the legend of the lost Dutchman's gold mine grew even darker, casting a shadow over the Superstition mountains that refused to fade. Ruth's body had been found, but there were whispers, quiet murmurs in the saloons and camps of Arizona, that his death was no accident. Some said the Apache spirits had claimed another victim. Others speculated that he had been murdered by another treasure hunter, someone willing to kill to keep the mine's location a secret. But no one knew for sure, and the unanswered questions only fueled the myth. One man, however, wasn't satisfied with rumors. His name was Robert Bob Ward, an ambitious prospector who had spent his entire life chasing fortunes in the deserts of the Southwest. Unlike Ruth, Ward wasn't a man to be scared off by stories of curses or ghostly apparitions. He knew the mountains better than most, having explored their crags and valleys for decades. And when he heard about Ruth's ill-fated expedition, Ward became convinced that the map Ruth had carried held the key to unlocking the Dutchman's gold once and for all. Ward managed to get his hands on a copy of the map through a series of dubious connections and a bribe or two. Ruth's map wasn't just an ordinary drawing. It was filled with cryptic symbols and strange markings, some of which seemed to correspond with natural features of the mountain, while others were entirely indecipherable. But Ward was confident that he could crack the code. After all, he wasn't just any treasure hunter. He was known for his meticulous research and his ability to spot things others missed. What drew him the most was something peculiar in Ruth's journal, recovered along with his remains. One entry stood out, dated just days before Ruth's disappearance. "The shadow is not the danger, it is what lives within it." Ward didn't believe in the supernatural, but those words stuck with him. There had been too many unexplained deaths, too many bodies turning up in odd conditions, dehydrated, throats slashed, skulls fractured. It was as if something or someone was protecting the mine. But if Ruth had made it as far as he did, Ward knew he could go further. He had to. The gold was out there, and if anyone was going to find it, it would be him. It was early October when Ward set out for the Superstition Mountains alone. He had no intention of sharing the gold with anyone. Armed with Ruth's map and a week's worth of supplies, he ventured deep into the wilderness, his mind focused solely on the treasure that had driven so many men to their deaths. The first few days of his trek were uneventful. Ward navigated the rocky terrain with ease, finding the landmarks indicated on the map, an outcropping of jagged stones shaped like the teeth of a skull, a dry creek bed littered with bleached bones. Each step brought him closer to the final destination. But as he ventured deeper into the mountains, the atmosphere around him began to change. It was subtle at first. A shift in the air, a strange silence that settled over the landscape. The wind that had been a constant companion in the desert suddenly died, leaving the canyons eerily still. Ward dismissed it as his imagination, but the feeling of being watched lingered, gnawing at the back of his mind. On the fourth day, Ward reached the same canyon where Ruth had disappeared. The narrow crevice Ruth had entered was barely visible, concealed by shadows and jagged rock formations. Ward paused for a moment, staring into the blackness, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him. He had heard the stories about men going mad, about the curse that followed those who sought the Dutchman's treasure. But he wasn't afraid. He had come too far to turn back now. With a deep breath, Ward stepped into the canyon. The passage was narrow and suffocating, the walls closing in around him as he made his way deeper into the earth. The faint light from the setting sun quickly faded, leaving him in complete darkness, save for the beam of his flashlight. The air inside was cool, damp, and carried with it a strange, metallic smell that made Ward's skin crawl. It wasn't long before he reached a series of tunnels, branching off in different directions like the tendrils of a labyrinth. Ward hesitated, consulting Ruth's map. According to the notes, the mine should be just ahead, hidden behind a natural barrier of stone. His heart raced as he pressed forward, his flashlight flickering with every step. That's when he heard it, a faint sound, barely audible, like the whisper of wind through the rocks. But there was no wind. Ward stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The sound grew louder, echoing through the tunnels, a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down his spine. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. He had dismissed the stories of the curse as nonsense, but now, standing alone in the heart of the mountain, he wasn't so sure. The growling grew closer, more distinct, and Ward realized with a jolt of terror that it wasn't coming from any animal he had ever heard. He swung the flashlight around, scanning the tunnel behind him. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty rock walls. But the growling continued, louder now, reverberating through the air like a predator stalking its prey. Ward's hands shook as he fumbled for the pistol at his side. His fingers wrapped around the grip, and he raised it, pointing it into the shadows. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice trembling. "I'm not afraid." The growling stopped. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Ward's heartbeat pounded in his ears as he waited, his pistol still raised. But then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing at the far end of the tunnel. It was humanoid in shape but twisted, its limbs unnaturally long and gaunt. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the beam of the flashlight as it stared back at him. Ward froze, his mind racing. This wasn't a man. It wasn't anything human. The figure moved, stepping forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. Ward's breath caught in his throat as the creature let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes locked onto him. In a flash of panic, he fired the pistol, the sound deafening in the confined space. But the bullet passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke. Ward stumbled backward, his mind screaming at him to run, to escape. But as he turned to flee, the tunnel around him began to shift and twist, the walls closing in as if the mountain itself was alive, trapping him in its grasp. The last thing Ward heard before the darkness swallowed him whole was the echo of the creature's growl, reverberating through the tunnels like a warning, a curse. When search parties went out months later, hoping to find any trace of Robert Ward, they found nothing. His body was never recovered, and the entrance to the canyon had vanished once more, as if the mountain had sealed it shut. The legend of the lost Dutchman's gold mine remains to this day, a tantalizing mystery, drawing in those foolish or brave enough to seek its riches. But few ever return, and those who do often speak of the shadows, of something waiting in the darkness, guarding the gold from those who dare to claim it.